So my topic is journeys through Englishes, taught, learned and applied. And I'm going to be talking about English, about teaching English to speakers of other languages. That's the TESOL acronym in my title there. And also about my own academic discipline, my home discipline, which is applied linguistics. I'm also very lucky to currently have the role here at York St John, as Catherine's just mentioned, of head of school of education, language and psychology. That's given me the opportunity to work with brilliant colleagues, really world-class colleagues here at York St John. And I do know what I'm talking about when I say world-class colleagues. And there are many of those here in the school. And they include my excellent colleagues in counselling and also in the psychology team, in linguistics, in languages, also in initial teacher education, and in the study of education, the policy and practice as it affects children, young people and families. And I'm very grateful to all of these colleagues for their daily support. I've been walking up rather nervously up and down the corridor outside of my room and been stopped by several of you. Thank you to wish me luck, which I badly need for tonight. So I'm very grateful for that support. I've also learned a massive amount from all of those colleagues from across those disciplines. And also, of course, from colleagues in other schools at the university and from my colleagues in the professional services parts of the university. So I'm not going to talk about that aspect of my job. I'm going to focus on the TESOL and the applied linguistics part in this talk. But I hope that some of the things I say will be relevant to that part of my job. Probably particularly the pleasures and the usefulness of collaboration, which is going to be part of one of the themes in my talk today. I hope that's relevant to the head of school and the school part. I will be mentioning some of the people that I've had the honour of collaborating with in my academic work on the research projects that I've done. But I won't be listing all of the authors of the reading that I've benefited from, as I would typically in an academic conference presentation. So if you are here or online and you know that I've benefited from reading your work, I apologise for not mentioning it specifically. I will be mentioning my own work, and there you'll find complete lists of all of your work that I've read and benefited from. So if you're online or here and you think, hang on, that's something she's read that I've written, apologies, but it is there in the published work. So I'm going to start at the beginning of my journey, journey number 1, and tell you about 5 other journeys that have brought me up to this point here to today. I'll finish the talk with some ideas about where I might go next. So that journey hopefully will not be physically, just in case anyone thinks this is a resignation speech. I'm thinking intellectually where I might go next in terms of journeys. So I'm going to start this talk right at the beginning, and here is my first of several maps, another theme of the talk. And this is my starting point. This is Dipton, a village in County Durham, where I lived with mum and dad and 2 sisters up to the age of 8 in the vicarage, with a bedroom overlooking the churchyard next door. Dipton, the main employment in Dipton from the 1850s up to the 1940s was coal mining. The 1840s coal mine was opened up by John Bowes of the Bowes Museum in Barnard Castle. And so I went to Dipton Colliery Infants and Junior School. And here's a picture of me with Dad and sister number 2 sitting on Dad's knee. I think I'm about age 3, and it's Christmas Day. And you may notice that what Dad is holding with both his hands. So he's got sister number 2 on his knee, and then his hands, which I think he's looking at with quite a lot of interest and some fondness, is both a mallet, a kind of hammer, but also an essential participant in our tradition, family tradition, of taking a photo on Christmas Day holding our best present. So there's Dad with his best present. So both a mallet and a best present. And the mallet, I think, is participating in this sort of family event. The mallet's a participant, something which I'll come back to later. I don't actually have a memory of this first Christmas, age 3, but my first memory is a little bit older than that, age 4, and that was standing next to sister number 2, who's in that picture, and asking her how she felt about getting another sister. Very happy, we both agreed. So here we are, sisters 1, 2, and 3. All right, so on to journey number 1, which was dipped into Billingham in Teesside when I was 8 years old. So there is Dipton, which is, let me see, yes, A on the map and B is Billingham. So it's only about 32 miles by road from between those two places. The red arrow is pointing to York, just for context. But at 8 years old, that did seem like a different world, moving into a different world. By taking that journey. And my very, very strong memory of that journey was how different my voice seemed to sound to the other children at my new school, which is Billingham Church of England Junior School, and of hearing the way that both me and my sisters' use of language fairly quickly changed, and probably because, of course, we'd moved and our environment and some of the things in it had changed. And we wanted to fit in to that new environment. And these are, of course, you may know some of the reasons why everyone's use of language changes across our lifetimes, and why, therefore, that languages, including English, are always on the move. So those 3 reasons for language change, broadly speaking, are first, migration. So that was my migration from Dipton to Billingham. Migration and language mixing. 2, technological changes in the things that are around us in our environment. And 3, group needs. Either to be the same, in my case, in my sister's case, as our friends, or to be different, typically from our parents. Sorry about that. So I remember that difference because of the reaction, the difference between my voice and the voices around me, because of the reaction to that difference and the effect of the difference in the playground, feeling strange and like a stranger. And an example of new technology, new stuff surrounded me in my new environment, marbles, which was the cool thing to do in the playground, aged 8. So we learned, me and my 2 sisters learned new words for these new things to adapt to this change. So we added these new words to our range of linguistic resources as a result of that move. So I just checked this with sister number 2 the day before yesterday. Milkies, steelies, blobbers, colouredy blobbers, clearies, cat's eyes, glassies, and of course all of the actions associated with using those marbles. And next, which is typical of the type of English language teaching that I was trained to do, is a discussion task for you. So, as a child, did you have marbles? What did you call them? Did you move around as a child? Did you notice differences in the way that people communicated? You've just got 1 minute, just 1 minute, but could you, it's rather dark, so you might not be able to see the person sitting next to you, but if you can see the person sitting next to you, can you turn to them and ask them this question and just talk to each other? I'll give you a minute to do that. Off you go. Okay. Okay, thank you. That's your minute. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. I look forward to hearing what you had to say later over that glass of wine. Thank you. All right, so best thing about that move to Billingham, apart from the marbles, was sister number 4. Here she is in Kilburn, so a later move in which I didn't participate because I'd already gone to university, but here she is in Kilburn, North Yorkshire, with Poppy the lamb in the vicarage garden. But just back in Billingham for a moment, that was the beginning of journey number 2, which I'm going to move on to now. And at the beginning of that journey was when one sister, I think it was number 3, answered the phone and shouted up the stairs, "Rachel, there's a lady with a posh voice on the phone for you." A woman on the phone was my future academic tutor from St Hugh's College, offering me a place to study English language and literature at Oxford. And so that's journey number 2 from Billingham to Oxford. So this is my second journey, and I arrived to find some similar communication challenges, this time adding social class into the mix with geography. You might recognise 1 or 2 of these people who were in the same year as me. Person sitting on the front row, very recognisable hairstyle. And someone in the back row, second from the left, who was the same age as me. So that's my second journey, social class added into the mix with geography when it comes to variation. I did find my own really great friendship group at Oxford. You'll be not surprised to hear it wasn't in the Bullingdon Club, but it was on my corridor at St Hugh's, and also in the university newspaper, where I first started as company secretary because it was the job that no other student wanted to do. It was doing the accounts for the company that owned the newspaper. Everybody else wanted to be an art correspondent. So I learned about the finances and then used that knowledge to leverage myself into being chair of the company that owns the newspaper by my final year. And every year we had, the newspaper staff had a vote for the prize of pushiest fresher, which sounds a bit cruel, doesn't it, now? It was a long time ago. And in my second year at the newspaper, it was this person who my dear colleagues here from Initial Teacher Education at York St John are especially well placed perhaps to recognise, given his subsequent influence on their profession. The language part of my degree at Oxford included a first year module on Anglo-Saxon, or what's sometimes called Old English. So this particular journey became not just about language variation and change across places and social groups, but also across time. And here's an extract from an Anglo-Saxon poem called The Wanderer, which is just there for your pleasure. If you're a Tolkien fan, you might recognise the first line, maybe, of this extract, which occurs in a speech by Theoden, King of Rohan, in The Two Towers, one of the books of Lord of the Rings. Where come Mag, where come Mago, etc. So here's the beginning of, or a beginning, sorry, I should say, here's a beginning of what now gets described as English. Though, of course, unlike a university degree programme, there's no actual point at which we can say English was in its first year. Given what we've already seen, I hope that languages are always and have always been on the move. So there's no beginning for English. Which brings me to journey number 3, which was having completed a short English language teacher training course, the CELTA. I went to a job at Auckland House School for Girls in Shimla in India. You can see that on the map. So at Auckland House School, informed by the CELTA, knowing no better, it was my first teaching job, I prepared a lesson for beginners in English, only to find that the girls in my class had already read the complete works of Dickens. And this, looking back on it now, and with some sort of growing awareness at the time, was my first encounter with what now gets called world Englishes, the ways of using English that have evolved to meet the communication needs of speakers in different places around the world. It was also the end, I think, of any idea that I had about proper English, proper English, or of the best English being spoken by English people, because I'd already experienced quite a lot of that variation, geographical, class, time. So I sort of gave up on that idea of proper English, or even un-English. And it was also the beginning of an awareness of the easiness with which I could travel and get work around the world, and a related extreme uneasiness with ideas related to that kind of privilege, such as native speaker, and native speakers being the owner and best users of their language. That lesson, which I've just described, was also the first of many bad lessons I have taught, mainly often bad because I've completely underestimated what my students bring to their learning. Journey number 4 was from Shimla in India to Kediri in Indonesia. And this was where I did 2 years on a voluntary services overseas project at a teacher training college in Kediri in East Java. That 2 years turned by accident into 15 years of teaching English, managing schools, and also teacher training. And here, that's the map. Let's show you where I'm talking about. And here's a picture of me in the first year of that project. Apologies, some of you have heard this story before because it's one of my favourites. But in this picture, I'm wearing a new dress. I bought this dress especially for an English night, which my lovely students organised. They sang songs in English, they'd written poems in English, and the whole college was there, and we entertained students and staff. I was really happy. Many weeks after that event, after I'd worn this particular dress many times in class, one very brave student, possibly that one that's in the picture with me there, stayed behind a bit after class to tell me very quietly that the dress that I was wearing was in fact a nightie. So one of my most memorable, but by that time, honestly, already very many different understandings of what things are, including dresses, and what we think of as English. One benefit of those accidental 15 years was these two. They are my best work ever. And then on to journey number 5, which was from Indonesia to York and straight to York St John. And here there are too many good experiences for me to talk about. So I just picked 2. This one, and some of you might have been there, was our graduation ceremony in 2018. I'd proposed Eddie Izzard for an honorary doctorate, which is really great fun. He's an amazing advocate for learning language and languages, and he agreed to come along and take the honorary doctorate at York Minster. So wonderful, wonderful occasion. I think I was also reading the names, which is my favourite part of my job, reading the names of students as they come across the stage. And I read a short speech about Eddie and his contribution. We had lunch afterwards in the Merchant Taylor's Hall, which is very nice, but it rained. It was really rainy, and I've got a terrible sense of direction and was so stressed and confused. I couldn't quite work out how to get back to the train station, which sounds totally ridiculous. So instead of calling a taxi, I called sister number 2, who works around the corner from me, and she ran over to Merchant Taylor's, and the three of us ran to the train station in the pouring rain. Eddie, an actual runner, in his 6-inch heels, running in front of us, and me and sister number 2 trying to keep up behind him in the pouring rain. So if I look a bit stressed in that photograph, that's why. And the second great experience, which I'm going to talk about, was it was actually also in 2018, but it was hosting at York St John the annual conference for the British Association for Applied Linguistics, which is my scholarly association, BAL. It's also known as BAL. We had more than 300 delegates from more than 30 countries, and I really enjoyed working for BAL. Catherine mentioned in the beginning, I'm currently the membership secretary and on the executive committee, which is a great honour. If anyone would like to come and talk to me afterwards about the many benefits of being a member of BAL, yeah, please do so. I will sign you up. Small charge, very, very worthwhile. So that summer was so incredibly busy. That was 2018. I'd had, ashamed to say, very little time to prepare my teaching for semester 1. I was teaching a master's level module called, helpfully vague title, Themes in Applied Linguistics. And I needed an assessed project for that. And in the final plenary talk for the BAL conference, my very dear colleague, Professor Chris Hall, mentioned that the founding chair of BAL had been born in York, which I hadn't known up to that point, into a Quaker family here in York with very strong connections to Bootham School. That was all the preparation for my module that I needed. And my really fabulous students took the knowledge that one of the founding thinkers in the discipline of applied linguistics had been born around the corner from York St John University, and they very enthusiastically pursued that idea. And here you can see one of the outputs of that project, a blue plaque on the house where Pitt Corder, the name of our founding chair, was born. And we had a marvellous unveiling event here in this creative centre with the Lord and Lady Mayoress of York, representatives of Bootham School, the current chair of BAL, Professor Ju Hua, and 2 previous chairs. So I felt very proud of the students. They changed the landscape of their city, which is very good work. So my first role at York St John, as Catherine said, was coordinator of what was called at the time the International Foundation Programme. I was also teaching on the BA English Language and Linguistics, a 3rd-year module, which was designed to prepare students who were interested in teaching English to speakers of other languages, TESOL. So that is what I'd been doing in India and Indonesia. And I arranged for some of those classes to meet. So I had the international students on the foundation programme and the 3rd-year undergraduates meeting to talk about language learning and teaching. And I asked them to make audio recordings of those conversations, and those audio recordings provided the data for the first bit of research that I did at York St John. So on the next slide, you can see a transcription of a small part of that data that got recorded. Transcription it's part of a conversation between one of the international students who was on the foundation programme and one of the home students. And these are very arbitrary distinctions, aren't they, between international and home, but one of the home students on the BA English Language and Linguistics. So that's the transcription, a tiny part of their conversation. O is the home student and S is the international student. As part of this project, they recorded the conversation, they worked jointly on the transcription, and then they looked at the language they'd used to complete their task with a special focus on how they'd navigated any misunderstandings. And these students, these 2 students, noticed how in line 4 of this transcript, the international students, there's a 2-second pause, number 2 in brackets there in line 4, that's 2-second pause. And then the international student says, makes a sound, And that is taken up, you can see in the next line, by the home student as evidence of a misunderstanding, and the home student accommodates that and adjusts by switching from lessons in the first attempt to foundation programme in the second attempt at the question. The next turn taken by the international student in line 8 shows that the problem actually wasn't a language-based one at all, but it was the fact that I wasn't actually teaching the module that the international student was taking at the time of the conversation. And the students discussed the assumptions behind what had happened here, as well as the features, the linguistic features of this particular interaction. When I did this project, the English language teaching research literature generally understood this type of interaction as evidence of the use of what were called communication strategies. And I looked at my data in that way too, but I also used a sociolinguistic framework that was designed to describe accommodation, how we change, as I'd learned in the playground with the marbles, how we change the way we speak depending on the context and the task and who we're talking to. So I used that framework too. And I also used some new thinking at the time on what's called English as lingua franca. And that's the lingua franca part is when two speakers, multilingual speakers usually, are using English as a shared language, a lingua franca, also known as ELF for short. And my data showed, I concluded that international students' expertise in the use of ELF, we saw a huge amount of expertise in their use of English as a lingua franca. What I then went on to say was that far from being in need of remedial teaching assumed by the International Foundation Programme, in fact, those students were already very skilled navigators of meaning. And that project was written up in this book chapter. Another of the outputs of that project was a Creative Commons website that offered the recording and transcription task that I'd done with the students as a way of trying to raise awareness of English as a lingua franca for all potential users, including home students. And that website was built with help from the Technology Enhanced Learning team at York St John, thank you. And one of the students on the foundation programme helped me with that too, thank you Dasha. And also an ex-English language teacher, colleague and friend from Indonesia that I'd worked with back in the day, thank you Wendy. On to discussion task 2. Back one, thank you. Okay, thank you. Discussion task 2. Just again, for another minute, ask a person sitting near you about a recent occasion when they felt misunderstood, or tell them about an occasion when you felt misunderstood as a result of something that you said, or maybe signed, if you're a sign language user. Perhaps they'll also tell you about how they navigated their way out of that misunderstanding. But any experience of being misunderstood based on what you said, you must have millions. So please ask the person sitting next to you, just for a minute, off you go. Okay, thank you. That's your minute. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. There's a lot of experience of being misunderstood. I can feel it, yeah. Good, thank you. So thinking about English as this varying set of resources, which varies around the world, and that includes in the UK, as I said, based on my experience, the journeying through the UK and over time, and depending on communicative context, that made me more and more interested in the content of what I'd been teaching English, rather than up until coming to York St John, the methods, which had been sort of dominant interest. I got interested in the content and the question of English. And in collaboration with my colleague here at York St John, Professor Chris Hall, we started to talk to our master's students, who were also from around the world, about what they thought English was, and working with some really wonderful alumni of the master's programme who'd returned to China to teach English there. We used a questionnaire and some follow-up interviews to explore their colleagues' ways of conceptualising English. One of the outputs of this project, was that one, Changing English's .online. Please look it up. It's a resource for English language teachers who are interested in exploring their conceptualization of English and the consequences of their thinking for teaching and for assessment. And there's a diagnostic quiz on there. If you complete the course, you get a certificate from York St John. So I urge you to do that. The uptake of that website from teachers around the world was used as evidence for what we call in universities the Research Excellence Framework in 2014 and in 2021. So I've mentioned collaboration with Chris quite a lot, and there's a little bit more to come. And this time also with Patrick Smith, we wrote a textbook about applied linguistics, which was published in 2011. And my contribution was really just to say to Chris and Patrick, who'd already written half of the book, when I met them, to say, please finish that book. It sounds really, really good. But they kindly let me join in with the writing of it. In that book, we came up with this definition of applied linguistics, which is up there. And what we wanted to do was stress the breadth of the discipline. When Pit Corder, and you remember his blue plaque that my students got put up in York, when Pit Corder was the chair, the breadth of applied linguistics was narrower. It was mainly language learning and teaching. And we wanted to show that since his time, since the beginning of VAL, a lot more professions had started to be thought of and think of themselves as also as applied linguists. So in addition to English language education or language learning and teaching, there's a whole list here, and this formed the structure of the book. So we wrote about all of these different professions in which language is part of the problem that they are employed to deal with in some way and help people with. We published a second edition in 2017, and we're currently working on a third edition for publication submission next year, hopefully. Another collaboration that I really benefited from was with a person I've already mentioned, Dasha. Dasha did the International Foundation Programme, and then she did a Master's by Research, and I supervised that. She was a brilliant student, but she's also, she's also a co-writer who has a surname that begins with a letter of the alphabet after W, which is quite rare. So this publication, as you can see, is Wicaksono, finally, and Jurovskaya. And together we also developed this website, which again is available, York's Hidden Stories. You can find that online, and I use that in my I'll be using that in my teaching next week, actually, with the students on our master's programme in TESOL, where I teach part of a research methods module. So we looked in this book at interviews, which was the data that Dasha had collected, and we looked at how interviews are a co-construction between interviewer and interviewee, and thought about how research participants are therefore not separable from researchers or research methods in our data. They only get separated afterwards when we think of them as separate, usually at the analysis stage. The data is created collaboratively. And that has some quite profound implications for our work with research participants and what we think data is and what it means. And then again with Chris and with other colleagues here at Yox and John, with masters and with doctoral students, we carried on our thinking about what English is. So that question of what things are is ontology. How we know what things are, epistemology, and then what we do about it, ethics. So this book is about ontologies, what people think English is. And we suggest that English teachers really need to think about that question because, again, it has implications for what and how they teach and assess. In this book, I also tried to think back to those days in India and think about the concept of native speaker and native speakerism and who benefits from a belief in that concept, which obviously is mainly people like me, and who is disadvantaged by the belief in that concept, which is pretty much everybody else in the world. And in the belief that applied linguists have methods and frameworks, one of which Chris developed in this book to help explore what English is from different perspectives. I've recently done some really interesting collaborative work, and I mentioned collaboration right at the beginning because it's been one of my favourite things here at Yox and John, and it's been a great honour to collaborate with colleagues in other disciplines here. One of these has been with the very wonderful Professor Divine Sharua, Professor of Counselling Psychology here at Yox and John, on a chapter in this book. And that chapter makes some suggestions about how we might decolonise the teaching and practice of psychotherapy. So it was a great honour to collaborate with Divine and to think about his profession and the research that's relevant to his profession from an applied linguistic perspective, and use the framework that Chris had developed to think about what things are, and with Dasha, when we interact with people, what is going on? Is it possible to separate out the results of a conversation, for example, between two people? This book actually started when Divine kindly asked me to do a bit of teaching on the research methods module for the doctorate in counselling psychology, and we got talking about hair in the sink and dirt, damage, rubbish, sort of what those things are and how those things vary across times and places, a bit like English does. And then most recently, another example of a cross-disciplinary collaboration, this time with conservator and clockmaker, Matthew Reed, a journal article which takes Chris's framework and adapts it to think for conservators, adapts it for museum conservators to think about what objects are in the museum, depending on who you ask and where they're placed and when we see them. So we try to think about what the objects in the care of conservators are at different times and places, so that conservators can have those conversations before they decide what counts as damage. Who says what is damage, and therefore what is in need of repair? And that's become one of my favourite questions, the dirt and damage and repair question. This is the object that we tested out that framework on. It's a silver swan, which is in the Bowes Museum, set up by John Bowes, who was the owner of the first coal mine in Dipton, the village that I talked about right at the beginning. So finally, on to last journey, number 6. It continues to be collaborative and continue to think about that question of what things are. So on the question of what English is, Chris and I have continued to think about that and coming to the conclusion that it's not a question of varieties of English, sort of around a core of the real English, but there are different Englishes. And that sounds kind of both simple, but also quite mind-blowing because of the different Englishes. What does that mean for teaching and assessing Englishes? They're different for every user. And they have, for every user, that their English has its own shifting and overlapping boundaries. Describing the use of these individual communicative resources as English, so calling them English, it might be useful for some users, for example, those international students who came to the UK. Here at York St John and all British universities, the idea of English is still very strong. And we have policies here to say that the language of assessment is English, etc. But for other users, the labelling of the communicative resources as English might not be necessary or useful, and they might not do it. I might call it something else. For example, in online communities where the focus might be on task achievement rather than on how the task is achieved. I've also been privileged to do some work with Professor Becky Muradas-Taylor, looking at access to language programmes at universities in the UK. And also with two totally brilliant organisations in York, and this is what I'm trying to work on at the moment. One is Refugee Action York. Our TESOL students have for many years done placements with Refugee Action York, and that's been really good for the students. And with Refugee Action York, hoping to work with this amazing organisation in York called Recycle, cycling retailer and training provider with a focus on sustainability. So with Refugee Action York and Recycle, I'm hoping to be able to work on a language exchange for our TESOL students who will work with refugees and asylum seekers in York to learn to maintain bikes at Recycle. This is a picture of their workshop, which they've kindly provided. And this project for me is a really exciting one because it gives me the chance to think about how we might initially try to give equal consideration to the contributions of all the participants in this project. The York St John students studying TESOL, refugees, asylum seekers, and the bikes. And that sounds a bit weird, maybe, but including the bikes, but it is an opportunity to try to remain alert to how the boundaries between English and not English get drawn, and also the boundaries between ourselves and other objects in our environment, including the bikes, get drawn. And also how the process of drawing these boundaries creates us and these other objects in ways which might be better or worse for all of us, again, including the bikes. So my question is, how can we work ethically with each other, again, including the bikes in that, noticing and remediating any negative effects of these dividing practices between ourselves and other people and what we might think of as bikes and what we might think of as people. So if we think that language or a bike or a mallet or a swan or a research participant or anything else are all different things in different times and places, which is where I'm starting to think, how can we bridge into those different worlds in order to make those journeys into those different worlds? And that's the question I'm thinking about at the moment. So where might the journey go next for applied linguistics, for universities, for each other? I've just got two suggestions. For those of us who work with clients, and that's quite a lot of people in my school, so students, patients, individuals, pupils in school, we probably need to stay super attentive to the possibility that we are not experiencing the same things, and to try to work collaboratively on ways of bridging these worlds by creating our own lingua francas. And secondly, I think we probably need to notice the contribution of our environment, including what we might separate out into our professional, physical and spiritual environments, including all sorts of stuff, policy documents, research methods, technology, feedback from students, etc. And try not to rank them from important to not important, or even real to unreal too quickly, but to notice their effects on each other and on ourselves. And finally, this one is a journey to a place too far for me to take, but it's in the news today, so I can't say very much about it, but it's an important topic. In case anyone here is planning the screenplay for a film about what we currently think of as artificial intelligence, please consider writing an important part for an applied linguist. I think they will be very useful. All right, so here we are, we're at the end. It's time for that glass of wine. Thank you again so much for being here. I hope I've given you something to think about, perhaps to use in your own journeys through your own worlds, in which you try to bridge into other people's worlds and create your own lingua francas. I'm happy to try to respond to questions or comments that you might have for the next few minutes. If you're online, hopefully you'll be able to make a comment on Zoom if you'd like to. Catherine's kindly agreed to handle that. So thank you very much for coming. Really appreciate it. Over to you.
Thank you, Rachel, for such a fascinating and a thorough run through so much in your lecture there. We've got a bit of time for questions, and as Rachel said, either online, if anyone's got one online, or in the room we've got some roving mics. So I'm just wondering who's going to be brave enough to ask the first question to Rachel. Got one in the middle there. Thank you. Just got a mic coming your way.
Thanks, Rachel. That was amazing. You'll know that BAL's in the middle of setting up its language and social justice special interest group because they're copying us for being so brilliant, basically. I wondered if you could say a little bit about what you understand the relationship to be between applied linguistics and social justice, because I know that that's something that BAL are grappling with at the moment and that clearly resonates with your own work.
Yeah, thank you, Helen, for that question. When you say they're copying us, what you mean is they're copying you. That was the Centre for Language and Social Justice Research is something that those of us that work in languages and linguistics are really proud of at York St John, and that was Professor Helen Saunderson's initiative. And yeah, very proud of that. And the precursor of the Institute for Social Justice at York St John. Our university has a history of working for social justice, set up in 1841 to train teachers. And we're in this, I mentioned Pip Corder, we're in this city with a Quaker tradition. So there's a lot of social justice around in York. And in applied linguistics, yeah, I mean, the definition that I put up on the screen that Chris, Patrick and I wrote was about how applied linguists are interested in problems in everyday life where language is considered to be part of that problem. So, and in solutions for remediating that. So I think there's two things there that could relate to social justice. One is that where language is considered to be part of the problem, where it isn't necessarily, it might be to some of the people who are in that situation, it might not be to some others. So I think that's quite a nice sort of caveat there, holding back from assuming that language is part of the problem. It may or may not be. So there's something to do there, I think, with ethics and not jumping into an assumption that language is the problem. The transcript of the two students talking was a nice example of how it's sometimes quick to assume that language is the problem. It might not be. And then the other part, I suppose, with applied linguistics and social justice is we are a solutions-focused discipline. And that's really important to many of us who consider ourselves applied linguists. And we're solutions focused and we talk about this in mapping applied linguistics in a bottom-up way, in a way that is where, as far as possible, inclusive of as many options and definitions of solutions as possible. And then we're keen on the testing of those solutions as well, and evaluating of their effectiveness in a way that's accepted and defined by the participants themselves. So centrality of user needs, that's something that we talk about in the book. Yeah, so I think it's a really good question, and it needs more thrashing out across the discipline, but the answer is going to be yes, that there's a very strong connection.
Thank you for that question, Helen. Have we got any other questions? Oh yeah, a couple there in the middle. Then we've got one on screen as well.
Thank you very much, Rachel. That was naturally authentic and genuinely funny. So thank you for the giggle. You've got such an impact and reach around the globe and through various aspects of your work. I'm wondering what legacy you hope your work has had and that it is having and will have being a professor here at York St John.
Thank you for that question. I think it's, and I hope I've made this clear, this is very collaborative work, and Chris has made a huge contribution to the thinking that we've done together. But I hope, in terms of sort of international legacy, the Changing English's website, I think, has had a good impact. We think it has, and we can see evidence of people changing their thinking about what English is, and that's very satisfying, because I think it'll make them better teachers. It might make them more confident users of English. It might make them more confident users of their full range of linguistic resources in whatever way meets their current communicative needs, mixed in with whatever, objects, gestures, other bits of language does the job for them in the way that they want to do it. So I hope that that sort of challenging of English as one thing, I hope that is starting to gain traction. And obviously it's other people's work as well as mine. At York St John, gosh, I love working with the colleagues in my school. There are so many brilliant people, and we riff off each other the whole time. I really enjoy that, and you can see it's taken my thinking, through the work with Divine, for example, in some really interesting, for me, and different dimensions. So I hope that, for example, with Divine and the doctorate in counselling psychology, me going into that class and talking to those students who are training to be counselling psychologists, offers them a different perspective on their thinking, on their profession, and on their thinking about themselves, which is good. We're a small university, and that is one of the advantages, I think, of working in a smaller institution. We get to know each other, and in School of the Arts, for example, I've enjoyed talking to colleagues in fine art about making things and the use of the workshops we have here in the design centre, a bit like the Bikes project, but more of a making things, that's early stages project, of getting people to sort of flatten out those hierarchies between students, community participants, the things that they're working with, and not sort of rush to prejudge a hierarchy of things. So, and that's colleagues in the school. So yeah, I don't know if that's a legacy, but enjoying working together. I mean, the thing that we've been talking about this afternoon is our new York St John Communities Centre. Some of you will have noticed on Clarence Street around the corner, if you're familiar with the city, there are 2 buildings that are being refurbished. They belong to the university, and that is our York St John University Communities Centre. So I'm hoping that that will be a really good venue for this kind of community-facing work, where we're layering up teaching opportunities for our students to do placements, research, students' research, and our own research, and a good contribution to the community. So yeah, I also hope working with colleagues will be something of legacy.
Thank you, Helen. I'm conscious we're coming to the end. So, Rachel, I just wondered if you wanted to answer the last question on the screen.
I'm not wearing my glasses, so I
How
can't read
can
it.
applied linguists translate their findings effectively for the general public?
That's a really good question. Yeah. It's an important question, isn't it? Because otherwise we're just talking to ourselves, and that's a really big danger. Well, one, it's probably a waste of taxpayers' money if we just do that. So it doesn't apply just to applied linguists, it applies to all of us who work in academia. But yeah, although we enjoy talking to ourselves, and I've expressed a lot of enjoyment in that activity, which I genuinely feel, but we do need to think through very carefully about the communication of our work. And to be fair to us as academics, and certainly at York St John, we do a lot of teaching, and that's a great way of disseminating our findings through our students. They go out and share that information with perhaps with their families and their friends. So the dissemination is happening, but yeah, we do need to speak to people beyond the university, partly so that people continue to have faith in the idea and importance of a university and support us when it comes to funding, when it comes to, controversial in York, but the building of student accommodation to accommodate students that are coming in to two growing universities. So yeah, we do need to face that challenge. And I guess this event is yeah, one really good way in which York St John does that. Yeah, and there are many others.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I think the wine and soft drinks might be calling, and for those online, I hope you've got some refreshments available as well. So those of you that weren't able to ask your questions, I'm sure Rachel would be happy to continue the conversation outside as well. But I just wondered if you could join me in thanking Rachel once again for such a wonderful lecture tonight.